We are here tonight, as Carla has so well told you, to think about what museums do. And we know that museums tell stories. We all know about that, and we know just from our own experience that some museums tell their stories better than others. But what we're not so aware of is that there are no innocent museums. There are no museums without an agenda in the stories that they're telling. I'm not saying they're guilty in the sense of legal guilt, but I am saying they're not innocent at all in the Blakean sense of being pure or naive. What I am saying when I say that there are no innocent museums is that each museum works to tell its assigned story. A story about art or history or science, a story that's simple or complex or straightforward or devious, moral or sometimes immoral, nationalistic or universalistic. There are nuances at times, and at times they're not. At times they're just propaganda museums. On the other hand, until relatively recently, and again I would time it with Fred's art beginning to push us to ask these questions, until recently the museum goer has been the innocent. Has accepted unquestioningly the narratives and the hierarchies of values presented to them by their own favorite museums of art. In other words, they've been reassuring us, and we've bought it. The theme here tonight, and the reason for the conversation that we're all going to engage in, is that every one of our panelists knows that museums, along with libraries and universities, are interlocked partners in the shaping of the knowledge, values, and hierarchies that govern our society, how we act, how we think, how we feel. And that the stories museums tell us are the truths they want their visitors to take away with them in order to support society's workings and to help create a sense of identity in us, the visitors. Only in recent years have museums been the objects of scrutiny and of a challenging of these stories. That's what tonight's going to be about. What are the challenges? What are the possibilities? What are the opportunities now? Only now, for example, when the National Museum of China, soon to open up, starts with this huge, immensely large, largest in the museum world space dedicated to telling the Chinese history story in the way the Chinese government wants it told. Still the same way, a tiny little portion dedicated to the Cultural Revolution, but mostly the same old story in order to help maintain the sense of identity that it wants in its people. But oddly enough, because I say sometimes these things have nuance, there's also a temporary exhibition of the European Enlightenment. So they want to make it seem as if there's also something moving forward. And indeed there probably is. It would be really overly cynical to say that there isn't some moving forward in the opening up of the story. But remember, all of this is happening at the very moment that the great Chinese artist Ai Weiwei has been put in prison for going a little too far. The museum retains the balance. It creates the balance. It explains the balance. A little bit further, not too far. Mostly the old story. That's what they do in China. In the New York Times, we begin to see stories, and in the art newspaper I saw about museums in Charleston. These are museums that have maintained, for the most part, the old story of the lost cause of the Civil War. A few museums are starting to push that story forward and to be more open toward the real, brutal history of slavery. But not all of them, and there's this tiny moving forward as the society moves forward. The issue is, how are museums changing the story, or are they reacting to things that are happening in society? We don't exactly know, but there's a kind of a relationship going back and forth. So slowly as the South moves forward, because it hasn't gone all the way yet, the museums are helping it along a little bit, but not too far. Not too far, not too fast. Museums of the Holocaust, another interesting issue, because the last survivors of the Holocaust are dying. The stories that were told in Holocaust museums are changing because they're trying to figure out how can we tell the stories to people that no longer were directly, personally, themselves, the victims of the Holocaust. Their parents might have been, their grandparents might have been, their cousins might have disappeared, a lot of things might have happened, but it's different than when it happened to you yourself. The story needs to retain its vitality. Museums in Auschwitz right now are trying to figure out how to keep the story alive so it still has impact. We have another kind of museum in the United States, which is very interesting, and these are called ethnic-specific museums. the Skirball Museum of the Jewish American Experience, the Japanese American National Museum, the California Afro-American Museum, the Chinese American Museums. It's typical in this country because encyclopedic museums tell the story from, in a way, the outside looking in. Curators collecting art and then putting them on display and trying to create a universalist story. You know, we are all partners in the creation of culture. The ethnic-specific museums were made to tell the stories from the inside out. Japanese Americans telling their story, Jewish Americans telling their story. The interesting thing is that a very good example would be the Museo del Barrio in New York, made to tell the story of the Puerto Rican barrio, is now expanded because the barrio has changed. It's expanded to tell a more pan-Latin story. It's the story of El Salvadoreños, of Mexicanos, of Guatemaltecos. It's a larger story. My first response was to say, this is fantastic, it's more embracing, it's more open. And that's true. But at the same time, the original people who founded the museums, who wanted to tell a particular story from the inside, they're feeling a little lost, a little abandoned, as the story gets bigger and more people are brought in. Museums are complicated organisms. As they move ahead, as they embrace more people, some people are left behind. My friend who runs the California African American Museum, used to be that museum was dedicated to two stories, civil rights and slavery. And she says, now we have African Americans, and I don't know, Fred, if you want to talk to this a little bit, who were not experiencing either slavery or the civil rights story. We have Obamas. We have Obamas who come from a different situation entirely, who did not experience these two things specifically. So what the California Afro-American Museum has done is to enlarge their mission to include more racialized stories about Rwanda, stories about Uganda, larger stories about blacks in Mexico, different stories, because the situation changes. This creates animosity and it creates opportunity. These are the stories are changing. So today we're going to be in our conversation. I have 2 minutes. Today we're going to learn about the stories we presume to be incontrovertible. They are changing. The stories are changing right here in Boston. An American Wing is now a Museum of the Americas. We are seeing in front of us, again, more embracing, more open, but sometimes problematic changes in the stories. We're hoping, and I'm hoping, that one of the things that we can do is think sometimes beyond the objects in the museums. We can think about the questions of why these objects are there, why the stories are there, why they were collected, what they're meant to say to us. That we can begin to be more creative individuals ourselves by making connections. Even in the old Wunderkammer, in the old collections of curiosities, they weren't innocent. They weren't just throwing things in the boxes to make vitrines filled with stuff. They were trying to say everything's connected to everything. It was a kind of a mystical moment. Everything's connected to everything. Maybe 500 years later, we'll find new ways to have everything connected to everything, and to understand, ask, question, inquire, wonder what it is that those connections are, and to not be too scared if our story shifts and isn't being told anymore the way we're used to it being told. And we have new possibilities for understanding the other. And remember, the other is anyone who isn't I. Okay? Everybody has a different story. And let's try to let them in and understand them. That's what our museums can do.